Is Texas back? And more importantly, can the Longhorns compete for a spot in the college football playoff this year? A lot of college football fans and experts alike are saying that Texas is the favorite to win the Big 12 in their final season in the conference. But do they really have a legitimate shot to make the college football playoff and be a part of that Final Four for the final season as well? In today's episode of College Football Talk, we're going to be answering those questions, taking a dive into the Texas roster, seeing what the Longhorns are bringing back, and where I think they sit on kind of the scale of contenders in college football. But if you want to enjoy this video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more college football talk like this. Without further ado, let's dive into it. The most electrifying environments, the most passionate fan bases, the traditions we hold dear, the tailgates we wake up early for, the memories we make, the rivals we hate, and the losses we try to forget. This is college football. So the Texas Longhorns are probably, they're certainly at this point the favorite in the Big 12. They're the most hyped team in the Big 12, and they are up there with teams kind of on the outside looking in to compete for the college football playoff spots with teams like Florida State out of the ACC or Washington out of the Pac-12, kind of the teams that are on the outside looking in comparison to teams like obviously back-to-back champions Georgia, even Michigan, Ohio State, and I'd say probably Alabama just because of the pedigree they have, but it has been a couple of years since the Crimson Tide were in the playoffs, so even they are kind of in that outside looking in. But for Texas, they have the team that made the college football playoff last year, and I know the Horned Frogs at TCU are maybe being a little bit overlooked because they lose just a lot of talent from that team last year, and they're certainly not to be overlooked. I think they have a good shot to make the Big 12 championship game again. But again, in this episode, we're going to be focusing on the Texas Longhorns because they are receiving the most hype. They're one of the teams I haven't really touched on too much yet on College Football Talk, and so I want to dive into what I think about the Longhorns. And I think we'll start with the unit that looks the most strong, and that is offense. There's one big question mark on offense, and really from there, a lot of familiarity and experience from last year returns, but that is at the running back position. A really legendary Texas running back at this point, Bijan Robinson, is now in the NFL, and Roschon Johnson is also now no longer a Longhorn. But so running back position is where the questions emerge a little bit. You've got Jonathan Brooks as a sophomore, not too proven. He had just shy of 200 rushing yards last year and 5 touchdowns on the ground. They're bringing in a really highly touted recruit, Cedric Baxter Jr., 6'1", 215-pound running back who has, I think, a legitimate shot to get a lot of carries this year. They got some youth coming along in that class with Arch Manning, who is probably going to be behind Quinn Ewers, but certainly, I think going in even into fall camp will be competing for that spot. But on Quinn Ewers at quarterback, the freshman last year, I think redshirt freshman, passed for 2,177 yards, 15 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. One thing that was kind of an issue for him, he was only 29 for 74 on passes of 15 yards or more, which was 80th among FBS quarterbacks. So the downfield throws were at times an issue for him. And some of the decision-making, all of Texas' losses last year were by one score. And so some of that youth and experience kind of came back to bite him a little bit. But I know from listening to Steve Sarkisian actually this morning talking on The Herd with Colin Cowherd, was talking about how he's really honed in on his nutrition and obviously just has more experience and has an opportunity to be more familiar with the offense and be able to read defenses better, because when he was basically redshirted at Ohio State, he came into a couple of games. I actually saw him. I went to the game against Michigan State, saw him come in and take a few snaps in the fourth quarter, and he looked. He's a commanding presence in the pocket. He's not super tall, but he's 6'2", 204 is what he's listed at in the magazine that I'm looking at. So I'm not sure if he's either maybe bulked up a little bit more with that nutrition being locked in, but he certainly is a pretty prototypical quarterback in terms of size and everything. So for him, it's just a focus on getting more familiar with the offense. And what'll help with that, I think most of all, is having 4 of 5 starters return on the offensive line. And that was another area where there was a lot of youth last year. They had, I think, two freshmen who started regularly, and they've got that being left tackle Kelvin Banks and right guard Cam Williams. They're both sophomores this year. And so both of those guys no longer having, the inexperience that they had last year will be huge. So that'll be huge for the O-line. And they've also got their left guard, Hayden Connor, center Jake Majors, and right tackle Christian Jones are all returners as well. And those guys have a little bit more experience. Jones is the lone senior, so they're a little bit young on the offensive line, but it's when you have an offensive line that has cohesion like that, and they obviously blocked for Ewers last year and created a lot of running lanes for Robinson and Johnson. Texas, the O-line and the quarterback having that connection is always very important, and so that'll help, I think, in some of those late games that they have that familiarity with each other. They've worked together now for another year, and I think in some of those big moments it'll certainly help. And then the wide receivers, too, is another strength for this team. You've got Xavier Worthy, who had 760 receiving yards last year, 9 touchdowns, I believe, to lead the team. And then Jordan Whittington as well. And then they're bringing in A.D. Mitchell from Georgia, who had some huge plays for the Bulldogs. If I'm not mistaken, I think he caught the winning touchdown in the Peach Bowl against Ohio State. So he's played in some big game moments as well. And I think that receiving core is probably, I'd have to take a little bit of a deeper dive in the rest of the conference, but I could probably say pretty comfortably it's the best unit in the best wide receiver unit in the Big 12. So offense, I think Texas, the only real question is that running back position, and also just kind of, the quarterback kind of getting more familiar and really cutting down on maybe some of those mistakes that he made last year, or being able especially to throw further, better, more accurately downfield. But then where some of the questions arise are on defense. And this was a really good unit last year. I think they went from around 99th and 100 in some of these key categories all the way into the top 30 in scoring defense, 21.6 points per game. They ranked 27th in FBS. Rushing yards per game, 127 or 125.7, 32nd. Passing, they were a little bit struggled against. They were 90th, and then total offense, they were 53rd. So statistically, they were better against the run. Sometimes, in a high-powered conference in terms of offenses like the Big 12, some of those numbers can be skewed. But, there are other teams that are in this sort of conference, and really college football in general is more passing, so you got to be able to defend against the pass. I don't think that's an excuse that can really be used anymore. I know it was something that probably you'd see in the Pac-12, especially when they really started airing the ball out more like a decade ago. You'd see their numbers be a little bit, off the charts a little bit in a bad way. But Texas, that's one thing they have to focus in on. And they've got a lot of returners on the line. They've got Barron Sorrell, Tavondre Sweat, and then I think Byron Murphy. He's not a returning starter, like a regular from last year, but he's got some experience and will hope to make his mark. And then another defensive tackle, Trill Carter from Minnesota, will also be a big addition from the transfer portal. So I think the defensive line, the key thing for them, and obviously this is from the linebacker level as well, but Texas was literally best in the nation in quarterback pressures, but they finished just 71st with sacks with 27. So it's about kind of finishing those plays, and that's something that you see in the close losses where, yeah, you might pressure the quarterback, you might make him a little uncomfortable, but if you're not getting there and actually getting the sack, getting the loss of yardage and the loss of down, it can only take you so far getting that pressure in there. So if those guys, again, they got a lot of experience coming back. Kind of on the other outside edge is Ethan Burke, is kind of the expected starter. He's only a sophomore, so a little bit of a young guy coming in with, that can be good, could kind of come with your hair on fire and everything, kind of maybe, I wouldn't say chip on your shoulder per se, but at the same time, the inexperience can hurt sometimes as well. But having the guys on the other side, and Sorrell is really an emerging star. He had 44 tackles, 9 for loss, 5.5 sacks, and 7 QB hurries and a fumble. So he is kind of an emerging star on the defense. Baron Sorrell is. But then shifting back to the linebackers, they've got Jalen Ford, who is a very experienced senior. Having a guy at that kind of, at that linebacker position that has a lot of experience like that is always huge. And then, the other linebacker position, they don't return a starter, but I think David Gabenda, I hope I'm saying that right, is the other linebacker. And then looking into the secondary, and this affects the front seven as well, or front six, I think is what they run with, but the ability to create turnovers. They were only 104th nationally with 14 forced turnovers. So again, it's kind of finishing those plays. Like, you might make a hit, you might get into the backfield, but if you're not forcing turnovers, and especially they only recovered 4 of 11 fumbles. So if you're not recovering those turnovers and pass deflections, they had a good amount as well, broke up 51, but only 10 interceptions. So I think the theme for the Texas defense this year will be finishing plays. And that is, it's stopping drives when they reach the red zone. It's forcing those turnovers, and it's making sure that pressure gets all the way there and that you do get a sack or more tackles for loss. So I think really the focus this year for Texas's defense needs to be on finishing the plays, and I think if they do that, they've got a really good chance to potentially run the table in the Big 12. It's a very competitive conference. It's been a couple years probably now since a team got through kind of really unscathed. I think, TCU did, and then even they get to the Big 12 championship and lose to Kansas State. Yeah, they had a perfect regular season, then lose to Kansas State. So it shows it's a tough conference to get through, to get completely unscathed. I think Texas has a good chance of that. At Baylor is kind of tough. Oklahoma, they just destroyed them last year. I'd expect that game's a little bit closer this year. And then at TCU and at Iowa State for the third and second to last games of the season is also tough slate. And actually, those 3 games, they host Kansas State, at TCU, and at Iowa State are all big games. Just also to mention some of those guys in the secondary, the returning starters. Jahdae Barron is a senior at their star position, which I got to be careful because I'm not an expert on defenses, but I'd imagine it's pretty similar to like a nickelback position, kind of shifting around in kind of the middle of the field and sometimes on the outside. Cornerbacks, Ryan Watts, Gavin Holmes, and then the safeties are Jaron Thompson at free safety and Jalen Catalon, the transfer from Arkansas, who had a big 2020 season before battling some shoulder injuries the last couple years. Those will all be big additions, and one other in the transfer portal is Holmes from Wake Forest. So they've got some additions that are coming in too to maybe fill some of those holes defensively. And to answer the question I kind of started with, first of all, is Texas back? I think Steve Sarkisian is building them up to potentially... they're going to have to be ready to compete in the SEC, and I think he might be. He right now looks like the guy for the job. A lot to be proven. This is kind of a prove-it year before Texas makes the jump with Oklahoma to the SEC. But I think they are back. Are they back to the Vince Young days? No. It'd be kind of ridiculous to say that now. But do I think they can get there? I think so. And again, it's probably not this year. I think it might take a couple more years, but if Ewers can stay there at quarterback for a couple years and they just continue to develop and grow as a team, maybe they get back really to that college football playoff level. But I think it's just a little too packed in that top 4. You've got 2 SEC teams that I would say are kind of locks for the playoffs, or one definitely is. Georgia's a lock for the playoff. I think Alabama's got a good shot. Tennessee is kind of another contender. They're borderline. I'll talk about them in another video. And then in the Big Ten, you've got Ohio State and Michigan, and then you've got other contenders like Washington, Florida State, even Clemson, maybe if they can get back to what they, where they were playing at a couple years ago, that level. And in the Pac-12, maybe in Oregon as well. And another team I always, I'm gonna have to make a video on them because it's easy to forget about them, but the back-to-back Pac-12 champions, the Utah Utes. So I think Texas they're in that group with Florida State and Washington and Clemson and teams that I just mentioned, but they're not in that upper echelon yet. They have potential for it, and I could see them proving me wrong with that assessment this year. But if I were to put a number on Texas, I'd say they lose that game at Alabama week 2 of the season, and then they drop maybe that Kansas State game or maybe the TCU game the next week. I think they probably get 2 losses this year, which, especially if it's only 1 loss in the Big 12, they'd probably be in the Big 12 championship game. I would say they're probably Big 12 champs with a couple of losses, which in this field this year, while there's still 4 teams, won't be enough to make the playoff. But those are my thoughts on the Texas Longhorns. I think they are really moving in the right direction. I think some of the hype of them, really having a good shot at the playoff is maybe a little bit over what it should be. But I'm really excited to see how the Longhorns do in Austin this year. But that's it for this episode of College Football Talk. Again, if you've enjoyed, please leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more like this, and turn on those post notifications too, so you're always up to date right when I post and you're able to get the latest in College Football Talk. But again, I'm Peter Burtnett, College Football Talk, signing out. Peace.